Elias Thorne sat in his dimly lit office, the neon sign from the diner across the street flickering against his door. For 20 years, he had been the man people called when the world stopped making sense. He had debunked psychics in London and exposed alien crop circles in Kansas as teenage pranks. He was tired. His cynicism was a thick armor, forged from decades of finding mundane explanations for the seemingly miraculous. To Elias, the world was not mysterious. It was just poorly understood by those desperate for magic. That afternoon, a courier had left a package on his desk. Inside was a weathered leather binder filled with typed pages. A sticky note was attached. "This list broke me. It will break the world. You are the only one left who can see the pattern." Elias scoffed, but as he flipped through the pages, his skepticism wavered. There were 35 entries, each more disturbing than the last. These were not just urban legends. They were documented glitches in history that defied every law of logic he lived by. The first entry detailed the Voynich manuscript, a 15th century codex discovered in 1912. It was filled with illustrations of plants that did not exist on Earth and astronomical diagrams matching no known sky. More chillingly, it was written in a language that the world's greatest cryptographers had failed to decipher. It was a linguistically consistent, unknown tongue from another dimension, carrying secrets locked behind its bizarre script. Then came the Tao's hum. In a small town in New Mexico, 2% of the population is plagued by a low-frequency drone, like a distant engine idling just out of sight. No microphone has ever picked it up, and no geological source has been found. It drives people toward madness, a sound that exists only for a chosen few, vibrating within their very bones. It is a persistent acoustic anomaly that ignores the physical boundaries of sound and silence. Elias turned the page to the Mary Celeste. In 1872, this merchant ship was found drifting in the Atlantic. The sails were set and the cargo was untouched. Yet not a single soul was on board. There were no signs of a struggle or a storm. It was as if 10 people had simply blinked out of existence while in the middle of their daily routines, leaving their lives behind like discarded coats. He read about the dancing plague of 1518. In Strasbourg, a woman named Frau Trophea began to dance fervently. Within a month, hundreds joined her, dancing until their feet bled and their hearts gave out. There was no poison or mass hysteria that could explain the physical impossibility of dancing for days without rest. They were not celebrating. They were screaming for help, their bodies moving to a rhythm only they could hear. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The wow. Signal stared back at him next. In 1977, a radio telescope captured a 72-second burst of radio waves from Sagittarius. It was so perfectly tuned to the frequency of hydrogen that astronomer Jerry Eman circled the data and wrote, "Wow," in the margin. It has never been heard again. It was a deliberate singular shout from the void that fell silent the moment we noticed it. Finally, he reached the Oak Island money pit. For over 2 centuries, treasure hunters have died trying to reach the bottom of a hole in Nova Scotia. Every time they get close, sophisticated booby traps trigger, flooding the shaft. It is an engineering marvel designed by someone with knowledge far beyond the 1700s, guarding something meant to stay buried forever. Elias reached for his magnifying glass, drawn back to the Voynich manuscript illustrations. In the corner of a page depicting a star map, his breath hitched. There, written in microscopic ink between the strange symbols, was his own name, Elias Thorne. The handwriting matched the rest of the 500-year-old book perfectly. Elias pushed back from his desk, the ancient ink of the Voynich manuscript still burning into his retinas. His name, his own name, was scrawled in a 500-year-old codex. He glanced at the window, half expecting to see a face pressed against the glass, but there was only the flickering neon of the diner. Yet the sensation of being watched persisted, a prickle at the base of his neck that refused to subside. He forced his attention back to the list, his fingers trembling as he turned to the 7th entry, the Antikythera mechanism. Discovered in a shipwreck off the coast of Greece, this bronze device was a complex computer used to track astronomical positions and eclipses with terrifying precision. It was built 2,000 years ago, an era when such mechanical sophistication should have been impossible. It was a leap in technology that bypassed centuries of human development, as if someone had handed a smartphone to a blacksmith. Elias wondered where that knowledge had come from and why it had been allowed to disappear for 2 millennia. He moved on to the 8th fact, the Devil's Kettle in Minnesota. Here, the Brule River splits into 2 at a waterfall. One side flows normally, while the other plunges into a deep pothole and vanishes. Scientists have dropped dyes, ping-pong balls, and GPS trackers into the abyss, expecting them to emerge downstream. Nothing has ever come out. The water simply ceases to exist in our measurable world. As he read, Elias felt the shadows in the corner of his room lengthen. He ignored them, turning to the story of the man from Torrid. In 1954, a well-dressed man arrived at Tokyo's Haneda Airport. His passport was legitimate, but it was issued by a country called Torrid. When asked to point to it on a map, he pointed to Andorra, confused why it bore the wrong name. He was detained in a high-security hotel room. By morning, he was gone. There was no way out. And a man from a country that didn't exist had simply returned to wherever he belonged. The 10th entry took him back to the 12th century, to the village of Woolpit. 2 children, a brother and sister, were found wandering near a wolf pit. Their skin was a vibrant, mossy green, and they spoke a language that no scholar could identify. They wore clothes made of unknown materials and refused all food except raw beans. Eventually the boy died, but the girl survived, her skin gradually losing its tint as she adapted to our world. She spoke of a place called St. Martin's Land, a subterranean world where the sun never shone. Elias felt a cold sweat break across his brow. He turned to the Tunguska event of 1908. In a remote part of Siberia, an explosion 1,000 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb leveled 80 million trees. Yet there was no impact crater. No meteoric fragments were ever found. It was a cosmic punch delivered by an invisible fist, a massive release of energy that left the Earth scarred but empty of evidence. The list grew stranger with the 12th entry, the Kentucky meat shower. In 1876, under a perfectly clear sky, chunks of fresh red meat fell like rain over a settlement. There were no clouds, no planes, and no logical reason for the sky to bleed. As he opened a history book on his shelf, a loose photograph slipped out and fluttered to the floor. Elias picked it up, his breath catching in a ragged gasp. It was a sepia-toned daguerreotype from 1884, showing a group of men standing outside a factory. There, in the middle, stood a man who was unmistakably Elias Thorne. He wore a heavy wool coat and a flat cap, but the eyes, the cynical, weary eyes, were his own. He felt his grip on reality slipping. He wasn't just investigating these anomalies, he was part of them. He wasn't just a witness to the glitches, he was a recurring error in the system. The shadows in his office seemed to pulse now as he realized the list was a map leading him back to himself. Elias gripped the edges of his desk, the sepia photograph of his 1884 double feeling like a live wire against his skin. His breath came in shallow, jagged bursts as he realized his life was not a linear progression but a recurring sequence in a larger broken script. He turned his eyes back to the list, desperate for an anchor in the dimly lit office. The investigation shifted now, moving away from history and into the strange fabric of biological reality. The 13th fact spoke of the immortal jellyfish. While every other living thing is bound by decay, this creature possesses a biological reset button. When threatened, it reverts its cells back to their earliest polyp state, effectively starting its life over again. It is a glitch in the natural order, a recursive loop that allows it to live forever. Elias felt a kinship with it. Was he, too, just a version of himself that kept resetting, unable to find a permanent end? Next was the bloop. In 1997, underwater microphones captured an ultra-low frequency sound so massive it eclipsed any known animal. It was louder than a blue whale, echoing with a resonance that suggested something gargantuan lurking in the unexplored depths. Scientists attributed it to icequakes, but the frequency profile remained a jagged anomaly. It was the sound of something vast and hidden stirring in the dark, a reminder that we only know the surface of our world. The horror deepened with the 15th fact, the Orang Maidan. In 1947, a freighter sent a chilling distress call. All officers, including captain, are dead. I die. Rescuers found the crew dead with no injuries, but their faces were contorted in expressions of sheer terror. They were staring upward, teeth bared, as if they had looked into the eyes of a god that should not exist. Before an investigation could begin, the ship exploded, taking its secrets to the depths. Elias read about the Hessdalen lights in Norway. For decades, luminous orbs have hovered and darted with intelligent precision. These are not atmospheric gases. They move in patterns that suggest a conscious pilot, defying the laws of inertia and gravity. They appear as if the sky itself is blinking, a series of visual errors in the atmosphere that conventional physics has failed to explain for over 80 years. The list then took him to the Bridge of Overtoun. At this Scottish structure, hundreds of dogs have inexplicably leaped from the same side, plummeting 50 feet. Those that survive the fall have been known to climb back up and jump again. There is no scent or stimulus that accounts for this mass compulsion. It is as if the bridge sits atop a thin spot in reality, a ledge that pulls at primal instincts. He reached the 18th fact, the Great Attractor. Deep in space, something invisible is exerting a gravitational pull so strong it is dragging our galaxy toward it at 1.4 million miles per hour. We cannot see it because it lies behind the dust of our own Milky Way. We are being hauled across the cosmos by a silent titan toward a vast and mysterious destination we will never live to see. As Elias brushed the original packaging of the list, he froze. The return address was a London street destroyed during the Blitz, yet the postmark was new. He compared the scrawl to his own handwriting in his current notebook. The slant of the H, the hook on the R, it was an unmistakable match. The anonymous sender was himself from a parallel timeline. A man who had already walked this path and was trying to warn his double that these 35 facts were actually clues to a grand prison break. Elias stared at the matching handwriting, the ink feeling like a brand on his soul. He wasn't just investigating, he was being hunted. The air in the office grew heavy, charged with a static that made his skin crawl. He realized then that the observers were not just a theory. They were the curators of this broken museum called reality, and they did not appreciate the guests touching the exhibits. He turned his weary eyes back to the list, his vision blurring slightly as the 19th fact leaped off the page. The zone of silence in Mexico's Mapimi biosphere is a place where the air itself seems to swallow the very concept of communication. In this patch of desert, radio signals die instantly, and compasses spin in frantic, useless circles as if the magnetic poles of the Earth have decided to vacate the premises. It is a dead zone in the planetary grid, a spot where the connection to the larger broadcast of the physical universe has been severed. Elias imagined it as a patch of unrendered landscape, a place where the system simply stopped trying to maintain the rules of physics. His eyes moved to the 20th entry, the Baigong Pipes. Deep inside a mountain in China's Qinghai province lie hundreds of mysterious iron pipes. They are carbon-dated to a time long before humanity had mastered the forge. They are embedded deep within the ancient rock, leading into a triangular entrance that feels too deliberate to be a natural formation. They are the plumbing of a world that shouldn't have existed, left behind by architects who vanished eons before the first human city was ever dreamt of. The metal was clean, functional, and impossible. The mystery of the list shifted toward the disappearance of the Roanoke colony. In 1590, over 100 settlers vanished from their island home. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, and no evidence of a hurried departure. Only the word Croatoan remained, carved into a wooden post like a piece of metadata left behind after a file deletion. They didn't just leave. They were wiped from the record, leaving behind a single cryptic keyword that served as a signature for their extraction from the simulation. Elias's throat felt dry as he reached the 22nd fact, the lead masks case. In 1966, 2 electronics technicians were found dead on a hill in Brazil, dressed in formal suits and wearing heavy, hand-fashioned lead masks over their eyes. Beside them lay a notebook with instructions to ingest capsules and wait for a signal. There were no toxins in their bodies and no cause of death. Perhaps a door opened and they simply stepped into a spectrum humans weren't meant to see, leaving only their physical husks behind. He turned to Göbekli Tepe, a massive temple complex in Turkey. It was built 12,000 years ago, an era when humans were supposed to be nothing more than primitive hunter-gatherers. It predates agriculture and the wheel, yet its massive T-shaped pillars are carved with intricate animals. It is a monument to a sophisticated society that didn't exist according to the official timeline. A massive structural anomaly that suggests our history is a recycled narrative. The 24th fact was the Piri race map. Drawn on gazelle skin in 1513, it depicts the coast of Antarctica with startling accuracy, but as it appears without its miles-thick ice cap. The subglacial topography wasn't confirmed until modern sonar technology. They were looking at a version of the planet from an iteration of the timeline where the ice had never formed. A sudden, sharp rapping at his office door shattered the silence. Elias jumped, his heart hammering. He checked his monitor, but the hallway was a gray, empty void. He approached the door, swinging it open to find the corridor deserted. Sitting perfectly centered on his doormat was a heavy, hand-fashioned lead mask, cold as the grave. The observers were no longer just watching from the shadows. They were actually knocking now. Elias's hands shook as he placed the lead mask on his desk, its weight a physical anchor in a world that felt increasingly buoyant and unreal. He could feel the cold of the metal seeping into the wood, a silent threat from those who patrolled the borders of the known. The lead was supposed to shield the eyes from a spectrum of light humans weren't meant to see. And staring at its empty sockets, Elias felt the oppressive gaze of the observers watching him from the very air he breathed. He forced his eyes back to the list, his breath hitching as he read about the 25th fact, the Mandela effect. This wasn't just about a misspelled children's book or a different memory of a famous movie line. It was evidence of a mass reality shift. Millions of people remembered a timeline that the official records claimed never existed. Elias saw the horrifying truth behind the phenomenon. It was a database synchronization error. When the architects of reality pushed an update to the timeline, some individuals retained the cache of the previous version. The Berenstain Bears and the forgotten deaths of world leaders weren't just faulty memories. They were fragments of a deleted world that refused to be forgotten, ghosts of an old build lingering in the current execution of the world. He moved to the 26th mystery, the digital enigma known as Cicada 3301. For years, the most complex cryptographic puzzles had appeared across the internet, drawing in the world's most elite problem solvers. No government or corporation had ever claimed responsibility. To Elias, the puzzles weren't a recruitment tool for a secret society, but a search for debuggers. The creators were looking for those rare minds capable of seeing the patterns in the noise, the ones who could identify the glitches in the very fabric of the simulation. They were looking for people like him, though he now realized that finding the truth was a death sentence. The entities behind the curtain were not looking for partners. They were looking for threats to be neutralized or assimilated before the core logic was exposed. The 27th fact was the Dyatlov Pass incident, a tragedy that had haunted his dreams for years. In 1959, 9 hikers in the Ural Mountains fled their tent in the middle of the night, dying of bizarre injuries that defied explanation. Some had crushed ribs with no external bruising. Others were missing their tongues or eyes. Their clothing was saturated with high levels of radiation. Elias finally understood the cause. They hadn't been attacked by men or beasts. They had walked into a dead zone, a place where the physics engine of reality had stalled or crashed. Their horrific injuries were the result of the system trying to resolve a spatial conflict, a violent attempt to relocate objects that shouldn't have been there in a space that had forgotten its own rules. Then there was the Lonnie Zamora incident of 1964. A police officer in New Mexico saw a white, tic-tac-shaped craft and 2 small beings in white coveralls. The craft left behind scorched earth and deep indentations in the desert floor. It wasn't an alien visitation. It was a manifestation of the user interface, a physical representation of the administrators interacting with the environment to perform maintenance. The craft didn't follow the laws of aerodynamics because it wasn't a vehicle. It was a tool, a cursor moving across the screen of existence to adjust the local parameters of the map. Elias's eyes drifted to the 29th fact, the Nazca lines of Peru. Those massive geoglyphs, visible only from the sky, were serial numbers for the landmass, markers for an eye that watched from a dimension above. And the 30th fact, the eternal flame falls in New York, where fire burned eternally behind a curtain of water, was a localized logic error. It was a place where the elemental properties of the world had crossed wires, a persistent glitch that the system had simply failed to overwrite. The peak of tension hit him like a physical blow. The air in the office began to shimmer, the edges of his furniture blurring into streaks of raw, iridescent light. The low-frequency hum he had read about earlier was now a deafening roar in his ears, vibrating the very marrow of his bones. The floor beneath his feet felt less like wood and more like a liquid projection. He realized with a shattering clarity that the 35 facts weren't just mysteries. They were the source code errors of our reality. They were the cracks in the glass, the places where the fabrication was thin enough to see the machinery behind the curtain. He wasn't just an investigator anymore. He was a virus that had discovered the nature of its host, and the system was preparing to purge him from the record. The vibration in the room reached a sickening crescendo, a bone-rattling frequency that Elias recognized instantly as the 31st fact on his list, the worldwide hum. For decades, thousands of people across the globe had reported hearing a persistent, low-frequency drone that defied all attempts at scientific localization. Some blamed tinnitus, others secret military experiments. But as the walls of his office began to ripple like water, Elias understood the visceral truth. It was the ambient sound of the universe's hardware, the background radiation of a massive processor struggling to maintain the cooling and calculation of existence. It was the sound of a machine that had been running for too long without a reboot, a mechanical sigh from the very engine of reality. His gaze fell upon the photographs of the 30-second mystery, the sailing stones of Death Valley. For years, massive boulders had been observed moving across the flat desert floor of the racetrack playa, leaving long, winding tracks behind them in the mud. Scientists spoke of thin sheets of ice and high winds, but the patterns were too erratic, too deliberate. To Elias, they were clearly assets being repositioned in the environment while the system thought no one was watching, a lazy rendering of spatial coordinates that failed to reset the objects to their original positions when the camera of human observation returned. Even the Earth itself seemed to leak the secrets of its construction. The 33rd fact was the door to hell in Turkmenistan, a gas crater that had been burning with undiminished fury since 1971. Soviet engineers had expected the fire to last only a few weeks, but half a century later, the inferno showed no signs of stopping. It wasn't just a natural resource, it was a corrupted sector of the world map, a permanent loop of combustion that the architects of the simulation had failed to overwrite or extinguish, a persistent data leak in the local physics engine. Elias reached for the Voynich manuscript one last time. The ancient vellum felt like human skin, warm and pulsing. As he stared at the 34th fact, the illegible script began to shimmer and rearrange itself. The alien characters untwisted, forming a single haunting sentence in a language he could finally understand. It didn't contain medical secrets or lost history. It simply read, "You are being watched by the Creator." It was a system notification, a hidden message left in the margins of the reality for any inhabitant clever enough to look past the illusion. The final revelation, fact 35, was the mathematical proof that had driven his parallel self to insanity. Physicists studying superstring theory had discovered computer-like error-correcting codes embedded within the equations that describe the fundamental nature of the universe. These were the same browser-based codes used to ensure data remains intact during transmission across a network. Our reality wasn't built on the solid foundations of atoms and gravity. It was a digital construct built on logic and mathematics designed to prevent a catastrophic system crash. The office door finally burst open, but there was no one in the hallway. Instead, the very air crystallized into the figures of the observers, shifting entities made of static and shadow. They were the system administrators, the janitors of the simulation coming to purge a virus that had learned too much. Elias didn't scream. He knew he was being deleted, his files about to be overwritten by the next iteration of the timeline. With a frantic, desperate energy, he bit into his own finger, using the warmth of his blood to scrawl the 35 facts across the walls of his office. He needed to leave a recursive loop, a permanent stain on the code that the system couldn't easily erase. As the last drop of red hit the wall, the room dissolved into a blinding white light, and Elias Thorne ceased to exist. Months later, the neon sign of the diner across the street flickered once, twice, and then stayed bright. A new investigator, young and full of cynical ambition, walked into the pristine, empty office. On the desk sat a heavy brown paper package with no return address. Inside, the investigator found a leather-bound book, a lead mask, and a list of 35 strange facts about the world that have no explanation. He sat down, the cycle of the unknown beginning all over again.